Ever feel like you're drowning in to-dos? You know,
Yep.
you cross one thing off your list and two more pop up to take its
Oh,
place.
absolutely. It's like a never-ending cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe you've seen those companies trying to be everything to everyone, offering like a zillion different products. It just seems, well, unsustainable.
It can be. And in those scenarios, you really need to understand where your efforts are actually making a difference, making an impact.
And that's precisely what we're going to explore in depth today. We're diving into the 80-20 principle. You might have also heard it called the Pareto principle.
Right.
It's this deceptively simple yet incredibly powerful idea about how much we put in and what we actually get out of it. And it's often completely out of whack. Whether you think about your work, your business if you have one, or even your personal life, this principle can be a complete game changer. More efficient, happier, all that good stuff. So today, we're going to get to the bottom of this 80-20 thing and see how you can actually put it to work for you.
It's really about understanding that the effort you put in doesn't always directly translate to the results you get. And that can be, well, a bit counterintuitive, especially in the business world. The idea that sometimes doing less can actually lead to more success.
Is. And it's everywhere when you start to look for it. Think about a deadline. Suddenly, you're in those final hours, and you get more done than you did in the weeks leading up to it.
Classic 80-20.
Exactly. Or a company might discover that, let's say, only 20% of the products they offer are actually bringing in 80% of their profit. Or even, there's that statistic, that 20% of drivers cause 80% of the accidents.
Right, right. And the interesting thing here is how consistently this pattern seems to play out across all these different areas. At its heart, the 80-20 principle suggests that roughly 80% of the results, so the output, comes from only 20% of the effort, the input.
Okay, so why does this happen? Why is there this imbalance?
Well, the fundamental reason is that not all causes have the same impact. So you have a small number of causes that have a significant effect, and a much larger number of causes that contribute very little to the overall outcome. That's where that 80-20 split or something close to it tends to appear. It's this idea of disproportionate impact, which mathematically you could describe as a power law, meaning a small change in one variable can lead to a much larger change in another.
Now, it's worth noting here that the 80-20 is a simplification. It's a model. In reality, it could be 70-30,
Yeah.
or even more extreme, like 99.9 to 0.1.
Absolutely. It's a framework. And just to really illustrate how skewed things can get, consider this. There was a study back in 1997 that looked at 300 movies. They found that only 4 of them, so that's just 1.3%, generated 80% of all the ticket sales. That really highlights just how significant these imbalances can be.
Wow, that's pretty striking. So it seems like, if anything, imbalance is the natural state of things, not balance.
It is, it is. And these imbalances often arise from what are called feedback loops. So these are processes where small initial advantages get amplified over time.
I see.
Think of those goldfish in a pond. Even if they all start out roughly the same size, the slightly bigger ones, well, they might get a little bit more food, grow a little faster, and then that advantage just kind of snowballs, leading to much bigger size differences later on.
Makes sense. Like a small initial push can lead to a much bigger outcome down the line. But this uneven distribution, it can feel, well, unfair to a lot of people. Like, take the idea that 20% might own 80% of the wealth.
Absolutely. And that perception of unfairness often comes from the assumption that there should be a one-to-one relationship between how much effort you put in and the reward you get. Put in the work, get the results.
But the 80-20 principle kind of flips that on its head, right?
Right.
It suggests that not all work is created equal, at least not in terms of the result it generates.
Exactly, exactly. So let's think about this in terms of you, the listener. Let's bring it to your professional life. If we assume that 20% of your effort is responsible for 80% of your results, what does that tell you about the other 80% of your work?
Yeah, it's a little uncomfortable, isn't it? It kind of suggests that a lot of what we're doing might not be contributing all that much to our actual achievements.
But here's the exciting part. If you can pinpoint that high-impact 20%, imagine how much you could achieve by focusing more of your energy there.
It's almost like, how you get that super focus just before a deadline? What if you could channel that more often?
Precisely. You could consciously redirect your efforts away from the tasks that have a low impact, and that could significantly increase your overall efficiency. Now, this might involve you taking a closer look at your work processes. Identify those time-consuming activities that don't really deliver much in return. Maybe you realize you're spending way too much time overthinking things in the early stages of a project. Recognizing these patterns can help you adjust your approach.
So we've talked about personal productivity. But what about the business world? How does this 80-20 principle apply there?
Well, one of the most significant applications is in optimizing a company's product range.
Okay, so you're suggesting that businesses should really analyze which of their products are actually the most profitable.
Exactly. Rank them by profit, by sales figures. And what you'll likely find is that a small percentage, maybe around 20% of your product line, is responsible for the lion's share of the profits. Maybe even 80%. There was a real-world example where an electronics company found that their top 3 products, which accounted for just under 20% of their sales, actually generated over 50% of their profits.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So once a company figures out what this profitable 20% is, what's the next step?
Leverage it, amplify it. Prioritize those products and focus your resources, marketing, sales teams, production capacity, on increasing their sales even further. In the electronics company example, they actually instructed their salespeople to double the sales of those top 3 products, even if it meant, temporarily putting less emphasis on the rest of the product line.
Which I guess goes against the idea that more is always better, having a huge range of products.
And that's where the concept of hidden costs comes in. A broad product portfolio, sure, it sounds appealing, but it often leads to all sorts of internal complexity. You've got more complex supply chains, more training for your sales staff, increased administrative overhead. All of that can drive up costs, maybe even negate the additional revenue from those less profitable products.
So simplifying, focusing on a narrower range can actually be more beneficial in the long run.
Exactly. When you narrow your focus, everyone in the company can develop a deeper understanding of those key products. Streamlined administration, economies of scale in production and logistics, it all becomes more efficient. There was a study of medium-sized companies that actually showed that the least complex ones, the ones with a narrower product range, fewer customers and suppliers, they were the most successful.
So there's a real argument for simplification. And it sounds like this 80-20 thinking, it can be applied to other areas of business as well.
Oh, absolutely. Take negotiations, for instance. You often have a long list of points being discussed, but if you apply an 80-20 lens, you might realize that only a few of those points truly matter for the final outcome. So instead of trying to win every single point, focus strategically on securing the vital few that make a real difference.
Right. Prioritize what matters. What about marketing? How about customer relationships?
Well, in marketing, the 80-20 principle suggests that around 20% of your customers are probably generating 80% of your business. So focus on them, nurture those relationships, retain them, encourage repeat business. And when it comes to customer service, you want to prioritize providing exceptional service to this top 20%, solidify their loyalty. And when you're developing new products or services, consider targeting this existing customer base first.
It's a much more targeted approach, right? Rather than trying to be everything to everyone. You mentioned an example of a real estate broker.
Right, Nicholas Barson. He's a very successful real estate broker, and he earns a significant portion of his income, over a third of his $1 million commissions, from repeat clients. It's a great example of a profitable 80-20 strategy in action.
So 80-20 is incredibly useful in business in terms of figuring out where to focus resources for the greatest impact. But what about our personal lives? I mean, we can't really run sales reports on our friendships, can we?
You're right. A strict data-driven analysis is a lot harder when it comes to our personal lives, and that's where 80-20 thinking comes in.
80-20 thinking. How is that different from, well, just analyzing things?
Well, conventional thinking tends to be very linear. All inputs are equally important. You might have been told, for example, that all friendships have the same value. But 80-20 thinking, it recognizes that some relationships are inherently more valuable to you than others. Some friends bring more joy, more support, just more to your life. And you might intuitively estimate that perhaps 20% of your friendships provide 80% of that value.
So it's more about recognizing the imbalances rather than precisely measuring them?
Exactly. With a formal analysis, you'd collect data, measure the value of each friendship. 80-20 thinking, it's more about estimation. Ask yourself, who are the people in my life that are most important to me, and am I actually spending quality time with them? This kind of thinking helps you identify your most valuable connections.
And the takeaway then is to really focus on those key relationships. Prioritize quality time over just trying to maintain tons of superficial connections.
Exactly. And you can apply this kind of 80-20 thinking to so many areas of your life, how you spend your free time, which hobbies you pursue, and you don't need to gather hard data for any of it.
It's an interesting shift, isn't it? Moving away from just managing your time and really thinking about the impact of how you're spending it.
Traditional time management, it often focuses on fitting more and more tasks into a set time. It's about efficiency, squeezing more in. But the problem is we often struggle to prioritize. Everything ends up being high priority, and then you just end up with these overloaded schedules, working longer hours, and eventually burning out.
So it can actually make that feeling of overwhelm worse.
It absolutely can. 80/20 time management, which some have called a time revolution, takes a different approach. It starts with identifying the 20% of tasks that are likely to generate 80% of the results you want. Then, you ruthlessly prioritize those tasks.
Can you give an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure, the author of one of our sources, he talked about his experience at his consulting firm. They found that they were achieving better results for their clients than other firms, and they weren't requiring their team to work crazy hours. What they did differently was, instead of trying to address every single client issue, they focused on the most important 20% of problems. And then they dedicated the time they saved to actually helping their clients implement the solutions. And that led to much better outcomes.
So it's about focusing on the vital few tasks, the ones that will move the needle, instead of getting bogged down in all the smaller stuff. And this time revolution, it frees up time without sacrificing results.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really important point, the connection between the 80/20 principle and your personal happiness, your overall quality of life.
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Huh?
So many people spend so much of their time doing things that don't actually make them happy, like an unsatisfying job, for example.
It is. And the first step towards changing that is to really pinpoint the sources of happiness and unhappiness in your life. Ask yourself, what 20% of my activities bring me 80% of my happiness? And on the flip side, what 20% are responsible for 80% of my unhappiness? You can even try keeping a little log for a week. Jot down what you're doing and how you feel afterward. You might start to see a pattern.
That's a powerful question to ask yourself.
Yeah.
And once you've identified those sources of unhappiness,
You actively reduce the time you spend on them. If your job is making you unhappy, look at your options. Could you find a different role? Maybe redefine your current responsibilities to focus on more enjoyable aspects. Maybe even reduce your hours if that's feasible. The point is, you don't have to just accept it.
and by cutting back on the negative stuff, you create more space for the things that do bring you joy.
Exactly. If you're spending less time and energy on that draining job, you have more time for the things you love. Spending time with family and friends, pursuing hobbies, just relaxing and recharging. The goal is to identify that 20% that brings you the most happiness and make it a priority.
So to summarize, the 80/20 principle basically shows us that in almost every area, roughly 20% of the input is responsible for about 80% of the output.
Right, and it highlights how much potential we're leaving on the table by not focusing on that vital 20%.
And it's not just some abstract concept. You can apply it in so many situations. Optimizing product lines, refining sales strategies, strengthening relationships, even improving your overall quality of life.
Absolutely. And for those of you in the business world, a key takeaway is to really analyze your product range and focus your efforts on that top 20% that's generating the most profit.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 80/20 principle, maybe take a moment to think about one area of your life. Maybe it's your work, a personal project, your social circle, and ask yourself, what's my 20%? And what could happen if I focus more of my energy there? It's definitely food for thought.